Oh my gosh, you guys. This is the last chapter of Sense and Sensibility. After today, we're going to say goodbye to this book. We've read Pride and Prejudice. We've read Sense and Sensibility. Next, we're going to read Mansfield Park. I've learned so much about this book, and I've had so many new perspectives. Thank you so much, everybody, and all the learning about um what's that word? Epicurism. I've made lavender water thanks to this book. We started reading Mark Nepo's The Book of Awakening. You've I've I've recommended so many movies because this was kind of a heavier novel. There was sickness. Marianne sprained an ankle, and she was maybe so sensitive. She had so many emotions that she kind of ran away with Willoughby. There was many discussions about everything they liked together, and then he was kind of a, as we say, F-boy, but player back in the day. And the balance between being too sensible and having too much sense and not show, it's okay to show emotions. It's actually okay to even be too emotional, but you want to have a little sense about it. We've learned a lot. And now we are going to conclude this last chapter. I'm sad. We're going to spray some lavender water, have some sense, pull it together as we read. Unless you guys want me to read this absolute doozy of a appendix about this guy by Tony Tanner who talks about how it's also about sickness, and it's also about, I haven't even, maybe I'll read it on my own and kind of try to summarize it. Maybe I'll do that as the last video because it's hard to say goodbye. That's not it. All right, chapter 14 of volume 3 of Sense and Sensibility. It's fun that rhymes. We are chapter 50. Chapter 50. After a proper resistance on the part of Mrs. Ferrars, just so violent and so steady as to preserve her from that reproach which she always seemed fearful of incurring, the reproacher being too amiable, Edward was admitted to her presence and pronounced to be again her son. Her family had of late been exceedingly fluctuating. For many years of her life she had had 2 sons, but the crime and annihilation of Edward a few weeks ago had robbed her of one. But it was her fault, so she robbed herself of one. The similar annihilation of Robert had left her a fortnight without any, and now, by the resuscitation of Edward, she had one again. It's your fault. In spite of his being allowed once more to live, however, he did not feel the continuance of his existence secure till he had revealed his present engagement, for the publication of that circumstance, he feared, might give a sudden turn to his constitution, and carry him off as rapidly as before. With apprehensive caution, therefore, it was revealed, and he was listened to with unexpected calmness. Mrs. Ferrars at first reasonably endeavoured to dissuade him from marrying Miss Dashwood by every argument in her power, told him that in Miss Morton he would have a woman of higher rank and larger fortune, and enforced the assertion by observing that Miss Morton was the daughter of a noble man with £30,000, while Miss Dashwood was the only daughter of a private gentleman with no more than 3. But when she found that, though perfectly admitting the truth of her representation, he was by no means inclined to be guided by it, she judged it wisest from the experience of the past to submit. Good for her. And also, just to note, the girls would have more money if Fanny weren't such a hoarding B-word, If Fanny actually listened to Mr. John Dashwood and the wishes of a dying man, these girls actually would have more money. It's actually, if you think about it, it's kind of crazy ironic. Mrs. Ferrars's daughter, Fanny, didn't want to give John Dashwood's sisters any money. And now her brother wants to marry one of them, and Mrs. Ferrars is like, but they're poor. Fanny and John Dashwood should have given them money, and they didn't. Upon their father's wishes. That's infuriating. Jane Austen, that is infuriating, and good for you. What a catch-22. That's wild. Mrs. Porter was the daughter of Noble 30 Master Dashwood. They three, but found out representation. Submit. Yes, she's going to finally submit because she learned from the past. Good for her. Fine. And therefore, after such an ungracious delay as she owed to her own dignity, and as served to prevent every suspicion of goodwill, she issued her decree of consent to the marriage of Edward and Eleanor. What she would engage to do towards augmenting their income was next to be considered. And here it plainly appeared that though Edward was now her only son, he was by no means her eldest, for while Robert was inevitably endowed with £1,000 a year, not the smallest objection was made against Edward's taking orders for the sake of 250 at the utmost, nor was anything promised either for the present or in the future, beyond the £10,000, which had been given with Fanny. Wow. It was as much, however, as was desired, and more than was expected by Edward and Eleanor, and Mrs. Ferrars herself, by her shuffling excuses, seemed the only person surprised at her not giving more. With an income quite sufficient to their wants, thus secured to them, they had nothing to wait for after Edward was in possession of the living, but the readiness of the house to which Colonel Brandon, with an eager desire for the accommodation of Eleanor, was making considerable improvements, and after waiting some time for the completion, after experiencing, as usual, 1,000 disappointments and delays, from the unaccountable dilatoriness of the workmen. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and look it up. I'm just going to go ahead and look it up. Dilatory, slow act. Oh. You think of a artery dilates and then blood can go. Dilatory, slow work. Interesting. Where'd it go? Oh God, where'd the word go? Dilatory. Where did it go? Dilatoriness of the workman. Eleanor, as usual, broke through the first positive resolution of not marrying till everything was ready. And the ceremony took place in Barton Church early in the autumn. Beautiful time of year to get married. The first month after their marriage was spent with their friend at the mansion house, from whence they could superintend the progress of the parsonage and direct everything as they like on the spot. Could choose papers, project shrubberies, and invent a sweep. Oh, just for old time's sake, we're going to go to the back and see what the heck that means. A sweep is a curved drive. A sweep. Invent a sweep. Mrs. Jennings' prophecies, though rather jumbled together, were chiefly fulfilled, for she was able to visit Edward and his wife in their parsonage by Michaelmas. Oh, that's right. And she found in Eleanor and her husband, as she really believed, one of the happiest couples in the world. Oh, Jane. They had in fact nothing to wish for but the marriage of Colonel Brandon and Marianne, and rather better pasturage for the better pasturage for the cows. I can't wait for Marianne and Colonel Brandon to get married, and I wish for a little better pasture for my cows. And those are my wishes. They were visited on their first settling by almost all their relations and friends. Mrs. Ferrars came to inspect the happiness which she almost ashamed of having authorized, and even Dashwoods were at the expense of a journey from Sussex to do them honour. I will not say that I am disappointed, my dear sister, said John, as they were walking together one morning before the gates of Delaford House. That would be saying too much, for certainly you have been one of the most fortunate young women in the world, as it is. Okay, but I confess it would give me great pleasure to call Colonel Brandon brother. His property here, his place, his house, everything is such respectable and excellent condition. And his woods! I have not seen such timber anywhere in Dorsetshire. As there is now standing in Delaford Hanger. Okay. A hanger is a wood on the side of a steep hill or bank. Hanger. And though perhaps Marianne may not seem exactly the person to attract him, yet I think it would altogether be advisable for you to have them now frequently staying with you, for as Colonel Brandon seems a great deal at home, nobody can tell what may happen, for when people are much thrown together and see little of anybody else, it will always be in your power to set her off to advantage and so forth. In short, you may as well give her a chance, you understand me? But though Mrs. Frost did come to see them and always treated them with the make-believe of decent affection, they were never insulted by her real favour and preference. That was due to the folly of Robert and the cunning of his wife, and it was earned by them before many months had passed away. What? It was earned by them before many months had passed away. The selfish sagacity of the letter, which had first drawn Robert into the scrape, was the principal instrument of his deliverance from it, for her respectful humility, assiduous attentions, and endless flatteries, as soon as the smallest opening was given for their exercise, reconciled Mrs. Frost his choice, and re-established him completely in her favour. The whole of Lucy's behaviour in the affair, and the prosperity which crowned it, therefore may be held forth as a most encouraging instance of what an earnest and unceasing attention to self-interest, however its progress may be apparently obstructed, will do in securing every advantage of fortune, with no other sacrifice than of time and conscience. When Robert first sought her acquaintance and privately visited her in Bartlett's buildings, it was only with a view imputed to him by his brother. He merely meant to persuade her to give up the engagement, and as there could be nothing to overcome but the affection of both, he naturally expected that one or two interviews would settle the matter. In that point, however, and that only, he aired, for though Lucy soon gave him hopes that his eloquence would convince her in time, another visit and another conversation was always wanted to produce this conviction. Some doubts always lingered in her mind when they parted, which could only be removed by another half-hour's discourse with himself. His attendance was by this means secured, and the rest followed in course. Instead of talking of Edward, they came gradually to talk only of Robert, a subject on which he had always more to say than on any other, and in which she soon betrayed an instinct even equal to his own, and in short, it became speedily evident to both that he had entirely supplanted his brother. He was proud of his conquest, proud of tricking Edward, and very proud of marrying privately without his mother's consent. What immediately followed is known. They passed some months in great happiness at Dawlish, for she had many relations and old acquaintances to cut, and he drew several plans for magnificent cottages, and from thence returning to town, procured the forgiveness of Mrs. Ferrars by the simple expedient of asking it, which, at Lucy's instigation, was adopted. He just simply went and asked her for forgiveness, and she said, "Oh, yeah." The forgiveness at first, indeed, was reasonable, comprehended only Robert, and Lucy, who had owed his mother no duty, and therefore could have transgressed none, still remained some weeks longer unpardoned. But perseverance and humility of conduct and messages, and self-condemnation for Robert's offence, and gratitude for the unkindness she was treated with, procured her in time the haughty notice which overcame her by its graciousness, and led soon after, by rapid degrees, to the highest state of affection and influence. Lucy became as necessary to Mrs. Ferrars as either Robert or Fanny, and while Edward was never cordial forgiven for having once intended to marry her, and Eleanor, though superior to her in fortune and birth, was spoken of as an intruder. She was in everything considered, and always openly acknowledged to be a favourite child. They settled in town, received very liberal assistance from Mrs. Ferrars, were on the best terms imaginable with the Dashwoods, and setting aside the jealousies and ill will continually subsisting between Fanny and Lucy, in which their husbands, of course, took part, as well as the frequent domestic disagreements between Robert and Lucy themselves, nothing could exceed the harmony in which they all lived together. What Edward had done to forfeit the right of eldest son might have puzzled many people to find out, and what Robert had done to succeed to it might have puzzled them still more. It was an arrangement, however, justified in its effects, if not in its cause, for nothing ever appeared in Robert's style of living or of talking to give a suspicion of his regretting the extent of his income, and as either leaving his brother too little or bringing himself too much, and if Edward might be judged from the ready discharge of his duties in every particular, from an increasing attachment to his wife and his home, and from the regular cheerfulness of his spirits, he might be supposed no less contented with his lot, no less free from every wish of an exchange. Eleanor's marriage divided her as little from her family as could well be contrived, without rendering the cottage at Barton entirely useless, for her mother and sisters spent much more than half their time with her. Mrs. Dashwood was acting on motives of policy as well as pleasure in the frequency of her visits at Delaford, for her wish of bringing Marianne and Colonel Brandon together was hardly less earnest, though rather more liberal than what John had expressed. It was now her darling object. Precious was the company of her daughter to her. She desired nothing so much as to give up its constant enjoyment to her valued friend. And to see Marianne settled at the mansion house was equally the wish of Edward and Eleanor. They each felt his sorrows, and their own obligation, as Marianne, by general consent, was to be the reward of all. With such a confederacy against her, with a knowledge so intimate of his goodness, with a conviction of his fond attachment to herself, which at last, though long after it was observable to everyone else, burst on her, what could she do? Marianne Dashwood was born to an extraordinary fate. She was born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions, and to counteract by her conduct was her most favourite maxims. She was born to overcome an affection formed so late in life as at 17, and with no sentiment superior to strong esteem and lively friendship, voluntarily to give her hand to another, and that other a man who had suffered no less than herself under the event of a former attachment, whom 2 years before she had considered too old to be married, and who still sought the constitutional safeguard of a flannel waistcoat. Remember in the beginning, she was like, there's nothing worse than a flannel waistcoat, and he's so old. And now she's sort of born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions. Good for her. But so it was. Instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion, as once she had fondly flattered herself with expecting, instead of remaining even forever with her mother, and finding her only pleasures in retirement and study, as afterwards in her more calm and sober judgment she had determined on, she found herself, at 19, submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village. Colonel Brandon was now as happy as all those who best loved him believed he deserved to be. In Marianne he was consoled for every past affliction. Her regard and her society restored his mind to animation, and his spirits to cheerfulness, and that Marianne found her own happiness in forming his was equally the persuasion and delight of each observing friend. She found her happiness in making Colonel Brandon happy. Sweet. Marianne could never love by halves, and her whole heart became, in time, as much devoted to her husband as it had once been to Willoughby. Well, but it took a time. I think that's very important. It takes time. Willoughby could not hear of her marriage without pang, and his punishment was soon afterwards complete in the voluntary forgiveness of Mrs. Smith, who, by stating his marriage with a woman of character as the source of her clemency, gave him reason for believing that he had behaved with honour towards Marianne. He might at once have been happy and rich. That his repentance of misconduct, which thus brought its own punishment, was sincere, need not be doubted, nor that he long thought of Colonel Brandon with envy and of Marianne with regret. But that he was ever inconsolable, that he fled from society, or contracted an habitual gloom of temper, or died of a broken heart, must not be depended on, for he did neither. He lived to exert, and frequently to enjoy himself. His wife was not always out of humour, nor his home always uncomfortable, and in his breed of horses and dogs, and in sporting of every kind, he found no inconsiderable degree of domestic felicity. For Marianne, however, in spite of his incivility in surviving her loss, he always retained that decided regard which interested him in everything that befell her, and made her his secret standard of perfection in woman, and many a rising beauty would be slighted by him in after days as bearing no comparison with Mrs. Brandon. The one that got away, huh? Mrs. Dashwood was prudent enough to remain at the cottage, without attempting a removal to Delaford, and fortunately for Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, when Marianne was taken from them, Margaret had reached an age highly suitable for dancing, and not very ineligible for being supposed to have a lover. Ooh, Margaret! That'd be cute if there was a book about Margaret. Between Barton and Delaford, there was that constant communication which strong family affection would naturally dictate, and among the merits and the happiness of Eleanor and Marianne, let it not be ranked as the least considerable, that though sisters, and living within sight of each other, they could live without disagreement between themselves, or producing coolness between their husbands. We did it! I loved this book. I was really on a roller coaster ride of emotions between Fanny being a jerk and John Dashwood not living up to his father's wishes and leaving them with no money, and the sum just getting smaller and smaller, and then Fanny and then them right afterwards being like, and I actually might need to borrow money from you. And then they get to Barton, and then Marianne sprains her ankle, and then she meets Willoughby and he saves her. And then they super duper fall in love. But then Edward Ferrars, it's just, this was a roller coaster ride. And I was not expecting it to be. And I loved it so much. It's right up there with Pride and Prejudice. It's just different, But Marianne got sick as a dog and almost died. And Willoughby came over and was just like, please forgive me. Do you pity me at all? And then we had to forgive him. And then all of a sudden, Edward comes back and we thought he was married. It was it was good. She left cliffhangers, which was fun. I don't think that happened very much in Pride and Prejudice. That was fun. This was a fun book. And it was her first. So, good on you, Jane Austen. Join me next time. We are going to read Mansfield Park. I haven't even bought the book yet. I'm going on a little trip to Yosemite this weekend, and I'm going to find the book next week and perhaps start next week on Mansfield Park. So I don't know one thing about it, so I'm happy to learn anything I can. Any comments are welcome. Any critiques are welcome. And Happy reading, everybody. This was so much fun. Happy reading, everybody, and TTFN, TATA for now. Hopefully that's not copyright. I don't know copyright laws, but TATA. One big TATA for Sense and Sensibility. Oh, bye, TATA. Happy reading.